springs, that's the subject of this film. Or rather, a couple of little techniques that I've picked up while creating work like this. In this case, for an automotive client, Volvo. In part one, we're going to look at a way to create this oscillating, loopable spring effect using C4D's fields. And in part two, we're going to look at a way of converting the sort of CAD data that you get given back into parametric geometry so that we can employ this trick regardless of where our geometry came from. So enough waffle, back to the office and let's get stuck in. This is our starting point for this section of the video. It's a rather unexciting stylized version of a little suspension rig that we've got going on here. And the effect that we're going to try and create is something a bit like this, just the oscillations you see in the spring and the cap and this sleeve that we have going through the middle. It's not the most exciting example, but it is a trick that is required when you do as much automotive work as I have done. So it is something that crops up every now and then, and I thought it was just a very simple way of exploring a couple of issues that we get when working with splines. So let's imagine that we had to tackle this problem of getting this shock absorber spring to bounce up and down. Now, if you look at the sort of finished animation I did of this little rig, you can see that we have things moving up and down, but they sort of fall off from bottom to top. So we have this base strut element at the bottom, which is this green thing, and that never moves. We also, oh, hang on, this is a new to S22. I've got geometry only on here. This is fixed. Then we have the spring, and that squashes, but the top squashes, but the bottom doesn't. The same is true for the geometry of the sleeve here. And the top cap moves up and down, but as one solid piece. So we have a few little things going on, but they all feel quite related. Now, if we imagine that we're just going to tackle this curly spring to start with, this helix, let's just have a quick look at how that's created. This is a completely parametric object. This is a simple sweep. We have an end side, which is the diameter of this cross section here, and then we have a helix. And this helix has got a couple of deformers applied to it. Notice the deformers are applied to the helix, not to the geometry. We have a bulge here, which just pushes it out, and then just to create a bit of correction so it fits nicely in the cap. See, up here it was moving away slightly. We just pulled that in with an FFD deformer. An FFD deformer, if you don't know, going to points mode, it's just like a sort of lattice, and you can pull points around and it will influence the shape. It's a good way of getting kind of smooth deformations over the area with just a few point changes. Okay, so that's that. But the first thing that you might think to do to get this effect is we have this pivot point down at the bottom, and that means that if we scaled the whole geometry downwards in the y-axis, it would superficially appear to do what we want. It kind of stays still at the bottom, and then we can squash it at the top. But if I take it to an extreme, you can see that there's actually a problem here. Because it's deforming the geometry, the cross-section of the spring is getting squished as well, and that is not what would happen in reality, because these are made of sprung steel, which is extremely hard, and so you wouldn't get this type of deformation. So that's the first thing that you want to discount. You generally try not to deform geometry if you can deform the splines that make it up first. It's a good rule. Now, that might seem very basic to a lot of you, but I've actually seen a couple of quite senior animators do this, because when it's fairly subtle, it's not very noticeable, and they didn't realise that that was what was happening. And you can get away with it, but it's not correct, so don't do it this way. So we put that back to 1. It's much better to deform the source spline, and in this case, if I do that, I'm doing the same thing to the spline, but because this is happening first on the spline and then the geometry is getting wrapped around using this end side, that cross-section doesn't change. So there's my first tip. Generally, deform and animate splines if you can, not the geometry that they've been used to create. Right, so we have arrived at the idea that we're going to need to deform this helix in some way, and as any of you with a reasonable knowledge of Cinema 4D will know, we're going to want to use some sort of deformer to do that, and often the go-to one is the displacer that can be used to displace points. So the best way to add that to this helix, if I've got that selected, I'm going to hold my shift key down, I'm going to go up to my deformers menu here, and I'm going to find the displacer and let go, and the shift key makes it a child automatically of the current selection. I'm just going to pull that down to the bottom to make sure that's the last thing that's been created. Now, the way that this is going to work is that we're going to need a value, an amount to displace. Now we have this height here. We want to squash it down, so I'm going to set that to be, say, -10. And the type, intensity centered, I'm just going to make it intensity, and the direction, I'm going to make it planar on the y-axis. So that means it's only going to work up and down. And you have to apply something that makes it then deform, because as you can see, nothing's happened here. And that's what the shading tab is for. And the best way to get a single value is just to add a white color to it. That's going to apply the same amount to every point. So what you'll see is the whole thing just moves down. Every point is being deformed by 100% of this value minus 10 centimeters. Not that helpful, but what we can then do is we can add a fall off now. Since R20, we have these lovely fields. So if I add something like a linear field, I'm going to go into front view so I can see the size of it. It's going in the x-axis by default, so I'm going to make it go on the plus y-axis, and then I'm going to shrink it down so that it fits basically inside the track of the suspension as we want it. So we probably want that to be about the maximum extent of the movement in between the cap and that strut base. And now you can see that we're getting this deformation movement. So that's great. If I up the strength down, we can get that oscillating movement back. That's usually the slider that I would use. However, you can see that's a little bit of a faff to set up. We've got to add like a shader in here, and we're going to see later as well that this is not necessarily the best thing to use to affect one of the other objects here. So this is a perfectly valid way of creating a basic moving rig. But instead, I wanted to show you in this part another way of doing it, which is known to sort of advanced users, but is not a piece of information that necessarily is passed down to beginners and intermediate users. And that's the fact that you can use elements from the MoGraph module here as deformers on geometry as normal deformers. So we're used to probably creating things like cloners and matrices and using some of these as effectors on MoGraph clones. But the fact that they can also be used as deformers is very helpful, but not quite as widely known. And there's an advantage to this, that a very small one in this instance, but can be quite big, that we're going to see by using this instead. So we're going to create exactly the same effect, but we're going to convert one of these MoGraph effectors into a deformer. So how do we do that? Well, the way of doing it is pretty simple. We're going to here use a plane effector as a deformer. So I'm just going to select this, and I'm going to drag the plane effector down to where my displacer was. I'm just going to disable my displacer for now. So we now have a plane effector. It's now part of the MoGraph module, but as you can see, it's got this blue colouring exactly the same so as all the other deformers, and so that's the clue we have that it can actually function as such. But it doesn't do so by default because it adds calculation time, and it's one of the rarer uses for it. So instead we have to activate it, and that is done by selecting the deformer tab in the plane effector, and you can see it's off by default. And one of the nice things about the MoGraph effectors as deformers is that we can choose whether they affect different aspects of an object, from points and polygons through to the whole object itself. And that's much less processor intensive because that is only having to calculate one point. That's the pivot point of the object. And then we get points and polygons as well. So it has that advantage over the displacer because the displacer will only always affect the points on an object. So in this case, let's make it exactly the same. Let's make it a point deformer, and you're going to see that it's going to go a little bit crazy, and that's partly because we've got this massive value. So if I set this down to minus 10 centimeters, exactly as happened before, you can see that we get this slightly odd effect here going on, where it doesn't seem to be working evenly on all of the points. And that's because we have to set up our transform space to be based around the effector itself, or the deformer in this case. Otherwise, it tries to use, I think, vertex normals, which generally stick outwards at right angles on a spline. They're not as reliable as polygon normals. So by putting the object space, we've kind of got this almost back to where we started. And we also have fall-offs here that can be driven by field. So all I need to do is drag my linear field in here, and we've got it back exactly to where we started. We don't want to affect the color here. It's not got no relevance, so that's just adds calculation time. But you can see very quickly we've got exactly the same thing going on here with a plane effector. And in actual fact, the linear field is not dependent on where it sits in the hierarchy in an object list. It's a very new feature relatively in Cinema 4D, and it's one of the few things that doesn't really need to be anywhere in particular that affects the geometry of objects. So I can actually pull it out and nothing happens. So the reason I'm doing that is we can reuse these fields in other deformers and other MoGraph effectors as well. So it's quite a good idea to pull them out, and then we can drag and drop them into other deformers, as we'll see shortly. So we have this plane effector working as a deformer, and now we want to get that up and down movement. Now you could simply keyframe it going up and down. That's okay. The disadvantage of that is arc directability. You'd need to create a lot of keyframes, and if your client comes back and they say, oh, we want the whole thing slowed down, or we want it sped up, or we want it more or less, or whatever it is, you're dealing with lots of keyframes. Instead, we'd like something that's a bit more parametric. And so the best, simplest way to do that is to add another field here, and then we can somehow make that field animate more procedurally. And the one that I will use here is called the random field. Now, again, you'll see that this random field does something a little bit crazy to the object to start with. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set it to multiply, because we are going to affect we want to affect the linear field randomly, and it still looks a little bit strange. And that's because we've got the wrong field space setting. Now, understanding field spaces is quite important, but they seem to be sort of a bit lost here. So there's three types. Now the first one at the top is called global, and we can visualize what's going on here if I put this viewport plane on. Now this is the random noise. It's a Perlin noise, which is very standard in 3D animation these days, and you can see that it's a sort of almost looks like the surface of the sun. And that means that every point, because we have this set to a point deformer, is going to pick up the amount of value in the random field from where it intersects this three-dimensional Perlin noise. And every point is slightly different, so they're all getting mangled and bent out of shape. If we select the other type, the field, nothing appears to happen, but in actual fact, what this now means is that it's pinned to the position of the random field in space. So if I move the random field, you can see that the noise moves. Just undo that. If I go back to my global space settings, it doesn't. It's sort of projected perfectly. It's almost like a camera projection, if you like, through the world. So they're the only two differences between those. But when we go to the third option, none, what actually happens is it's going to sample the value of noise at this point, and then it's going to sort of flood fill the entire world with one value. So you can see this now goes to one color. And so that value is now being applied to every single point. And that's why that we get something that looks a little bit more sensible. If I select this opacity, you can see that we're getting this oscillating effect back. All right, but what we want is this to animate. And one of the great advantages of this particular field, the random field, with Perlin and some of the other noises, but not all of them, you get an animation speed and a loop period. So if I set the speed to, say, 20%, and I set a loop period of 100 frames, when I hit play, you'll see I've still got my viewport. You can see the colors are shifting very gently, and my suspension spring is oscillating randomly, very slowly. So clearly it's very slow. If I put the speed up, it's going to speed up. If I set it to 250, now we're getting something that looks a lot more like suspension movement. And if we're going fast along the road, we might want something that's more like that for a visualization. And you can see these colors are just flashing. So if I can turn them off now so that you don't get epilepsy. And now we're getting that exact effect that we would want. So we're going from a value of nothing, no deformation, to a maximum deformation of -10. And that's all being driven by this random field. And the loopability, the loop period, is one of the big selling points, because looping is constantly asked for these days in 3D animation. Things are often repurposed for loops as well. So having this ability to both control the speed and the loop period separately is a real boon. So this is actually a great way of getting this effect to work. Now, before I get trolled by some of you, I just want to backtrack a little bit and talk about the use of the linear field for judging this main fall off, getting the no movement down here and maximum movement up here, because there is another way of doing this, which is technically speaking slightly more correct. Now, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to pull my random field out of here as well, because we're going to reuse that in a minute. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at another type of fall off, which is particularly useful for things like curly splines. And that is actually the point fall off. If I take my helix here and I drag it into my field list here and let go, I actually get my helix appears. I'm just going to turn off the linear field for now. And what that is, this is a curve fall off. And you can see that we get options which look very relevant to the spline. So we get the spline shape is a curve, and we get distance mode along. And what this means is that we've got a fall off happening that's going around and round, point by point, getting gradually more and more. And you can see if I hit play here that we're getting exactly the same effect. So it really makes very little visual difference at all. But in actual fact, it's technically more correct because it's following the points and they're falling off, which is kind of how the forces on a spring probably work. The added advantage of that is it doesn't really matter what the orientation of your spring is, because, for instance, I was to rotate this, and we're going to see later an example where the suspension is rotated in a funky way. We've got, obviously, our linear field here is outside of that hierarchy and is still linear, pointing straight up. But our spline fall off here, the curve fall off, is going to always follow the path of the curve, regardless of what orientation relative to the world it is. So it is superficially very useful. However, we can't reuse it for some of these other elements because it doesn't have any relevance to, say, this cap, a curve fall off. So I just wanted to point that out, that being able to drag and drop splines in here and use those as fall offs is extremely useful, but we're not going to use it in this instance. So I'm just going to delete the helix. I'm going to switch the linear field back on. I'm also going to return this to 0 so that we're back to kind of where we started. So we've got our oscillating spring back. So the next thing that we want to do is to get this sleeve here to follow along with the spring. And this is made using a lathe on actually a formula spline I've got going here. It's rather fancy. And this couldn't really be simpler with the way that deformers work in Cinema 4D. We have the plane effector here in our helix object at the moment. And all I need to do in order to make this work on the lathe is to duplicate it and put it inside the lathe hierarchy. So if I hold down my control key and I just drag it up under here, you'll see when I hit the play button that immediately this follows along perfectly. So the plane here is being duplicated, and the reference to the random and the linear field is being duplicated, but because they weren't underneath the effector itself, they didn't get duplicated. They're still sitting here. It's only the reference of them that got duplicated. And so what this means is that we've still got control over both of these elements now, but from the one random field. So if I was in play and I wanted to increase the speed of movement, I can do that all from this one interface, or slow it. I can change the loop period, the size of the noise, whatever. So there's a difference between duplicating a deformer and duplicating the fields. If I had these in here, which they're created by default that way, and I control clicked it, then I would be duplicating the fields, and those references here look the same, but they're actually now they're referencing different linear and random fields. So that's why, if I just undo that, that's why I pulled those fields out, because it stops me making that mistake, which is very easily done. So here we have now already most of the rig that we need, with one plane effector acting as a deformer. All that we now need to do is to get this cap at the top following along as well. Now what you might think we need to do is to play the same trick as we did previously. Just select this plane effector, this deformer that we've created by duplicating up from the helix, hold down control and duplicate it under our cap. And you can see if I hit the play button, it indeed does work. But this is also unnecessary. We're creating a plane effector we don't need, and that's because we can make deformers work on multiple objects at the same time, as long as they're arranged in a certain order in the object list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete that plane effector we just made. I'm going to make a new null object, and I'm going to call this cap and sleeve. I'm just going to drag that under this null for organizational purposes. I'm going to pull my cap inside the null, and then I'm going to take my lathe, and I'm also going to pull that in here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the plane effector that we just saw working on the sleeve, and I'm going to drag it out, but keep it underneath the cap and sleeve. So now we only have one duplicate of this plane effector, but it's in the same hierarchy as these two objects under a null, and so it's going to affect both of them simultaneously. And so as you can see, we've got exactly the same effect going on now, but we've only got two plane effectors acting as deformers, and we've only got two fields that are driving everything. Now, the only thing that you might want to connect together between these two effectors is the amount of deformation, because a client may come back and say, oh, we want more of it or less of it. So what you'll see here is I've affected the helix, so it's now not moving as much, but I haven't affected the plane up here because these have become separated parameters. But that's extremely easy to rectify. If you wanted to keep, say, the helix deformer effector as the driver, we can right click that parameter here, go to expressions, set it as a driver. We can go up to our cap and sleeve deformer, same parameter, right click, expressions, set driven absolute. And what you'll see is that everything will connect back up again, but a espresso tag has been created on the driven plane effector, and this is about as simple as it gets. In fact, this range mapper can remap values, but we don't even need that because in actual fact we're driving this 1-to-1, y to y, so we can even get rid of that. And now we've got control of the amount of deformation going on from a single controller. So that's the simplest bit of espresso you'll ever need to know, but it can be quite useful. Obviously, if you wanted to take this a step further, you would create a controller somewhere even higher up here to control both of these. So you had possibly that exposed in some sort of HUD. But we can actually do that here by clicking and dragging into our interface here from that driving y-axis deformation. And so here we can actually control in the interface, albeit slightly awkwardly, the amount here, and we've got a little HUD element. And how these work and how you can create your little HUDs is maybe the subject for another video. But here we've got a very nice and elegant rig being driven by very, very few deformers, in this case plane effectors, and very, very few fields. So it's very efficient in terms of processes and calculations. So that's all very well, but in the real world we don't get to create our own parametric sweeps willy-nilly. We have to work with very specific CAD data, which is often triangulated, can look a bit shit when rendered, and also definitely isn't constructed in the parametric way we need in order to work with the fields trick we saw in part 1. So I'm going to knock your socks off in this part with a really simple technique for converting any kind of tubular geometry, even if it's triangulated, back into those parametric sweeps so that we can create the same effect as part 1. Back to work. Okay, so this is the offending real-world example. This is an actual piece of suspension kit provided by an unnamed car manufacturer for me in a previous job. And it displays a lot of the typical characteristics of CAD data. First is there's a lot more polygons than there was in our earlier simplified example, and also everything is triangulated, which is really common in CAD. You also get issues with things like, let's go into polygon mode. If I select some of these polygons on this spring object, which incidentally it wasn't originally this clean, I've already cleaned this up and corralled everything into these 4 simple layers. If I want to select everything that's connected to these polygons, you'd expect it to select the whole spring. And I can do that by bringing up my fast menu, U, and then hitting W for select connected, but you can see that it doesn't actually select all of them, and that's because there's 2 shells here on the top and the bottom, and that's also quite typical. So you often have to be a bit careful with this. You might want to select the object, deselect your objects here, and if I go to the remove menu and go optimize, that's going to delete shared points, and so if I hit U, W again, it's now all connected. So doing things like that is something you often have to do as a basic cleanup step when you get CAD data. But obviously, if we want to get back to where we were with the simplified example, we don't have such a good starting point here because we don't have a parametric spring. This is just polygons. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a trick here, which I call spline averaging. I'm sure I reinvented this wheel. Someone else has found this trick before, but this actually happened on a real job with suspension, and we were rather pleased with ourselves that we figured this out on that job. So I've named it spline averaging, and it is a trick that I do use from time to time, so I'm passing it on here if you don't know how to do it. What we're going to do is we're going to take this geometry and we're going to get back to where we were in the previous example, turning this back into a parametric sweep, but maintaining the pretty much exact profile of the geometry here. So how do we do that? Well, we're obviously going to need to end up with some splines. And what we're going to need is a spline that runs right the way through the middle of this tube. And we're going to do that through this technique, which is what's called spline averaging. And the starting point is that we go into edge mode. And what we need to do is we need to select a loop of polygons going all the way around the object from bottom to top like this. Now, there are various ways of not having to do it totally by hand like that. I'm just going to middle mouse click here so we get this expanded view. The first tool that people use a lot, if we go up to the selector menu, is called loop selection here. Now, you can select it through that menu, but you can see, as is often the case with CAD data and triangulated geometry, it does an awful job of trying to select loops unless they're just going round this way. So instead, there's another tool which is a bit less used, but actually incredibly helpful, and it's one that's not available in a lot of other 3D software. I've seen people amazed that use Maya that this exists. So the way to access that, we can either select it here, and it's called the Phong break selection tool, or another way, which I use more often, is I can hit the V key, which brings up a fast menu under your mouse, and you get another copy of that select menu, and then we go Phong break selection. You can also hit U and then N immediately, so multiple ways of doing it. Absolutely nothing happens when I do that, as you can see. So how does this work? Well, you can see we get these tool options here. And the way that it works is it detects where you would normally get a Phong break. That's a shading break for smoothing on your geometry. And if we look at our Phong tag here, it's set to 40 degrees. I'm going to get back to my tool here by going Mode Tool. And I've told the tool to override that, but it's also set to 40. But what we'll find is if I pull this down, and I keep coming down, you'll at some point start getting these blue lines. And these are the lines where the Phong is continuous, but then there's a break alongside it. If I set this down to, say, 5 degrees, you can see that we get a very fast way of selecting the entire ring. So I can just click that once, and now I get the loop from top to bottom. Now, you have to be a bit careful with CAD data because you can not get absolutely everything. And we'll have a quick check of that now. I've got the spring object selected. I'm just going to hit the solo button, and we can see this ring carrying on round, and you can see that it stops here. So what you may need to do is tweak your Phong break settings to get the exact loop that you want, and then clean it up, because we want it to go absolutely from bottom to top. So there you go, 6 degrees seem to work nicely there. So that's the first loop that we want. But now what we want is we want a loop that sits diametrically opposite. So I think that's this one here. I'm going to hold down the shift there and click, which retains that first loop and then adds this second loop. I'll just have a quick check that that's gone all the way down to the bottom. It looks like it has. I've hit S on my keyboard there to frame the selection. There, that looks lovely. So what do I do with this? Well, what I need to do is convert these two edge loops into splines, and that's very easy in Cinema. We've got a tool to do that, which is not immediately exposed on our default interface, but if I hold Shift-C, bring up the commander, you can see I've typed this before in one of my rehearsals. We've got the Edge to Spline tool. Now, this is so useful that in my normal interface, the one that I don't use for tutorials, I would drag this button up and I would drop it there, so you can just click a button from now on. But in this case, we've got it here, so I'm just going to double click it, and you'll see underneath our selected object we get this spline. Now we only get one spline object. If I solo that, you'll see it's got two parts to it, and we're going to need separate access to these. So the quickest way for me to do that, if I go back into points mode here and I right click, I can say explode segments, and then what happens is we get this is effectively a container, and we get these two splines. I can delete this now, and the best way to do that is if I right click, I've got an option here called delete without children, and that will keep the two splines but delete the parent. So now we've got some splines, but what you might notice is they don't start in the same place. In the color coding for Cinema 4D splines, white is the beginning and blue is the end. And for some reason, it's made these flipped around in the opposite direction. I'll leave them for now so you can see the problem this will create as we move on, because it may happen to you and you'll be able to spot it. So the next step that I need to take is I'm going to make a cloner. And this cloner is going to have both of these splines inside. Okay, so something weird happens. You can see we've now got one spline. This is the default settings for a cloner, a linear cloner, which is actually what we do want, and 3 counts, which is also what we do want, but we've got this 50 centimeter offset at the moment, and we don't need any offset for this trick. We can just set that to 0. But again, nothing seems to have happened except it's moved. The reason that it's moved is because we've said fix clone, and so it's moving them to where the cloner object is. If we turn that off, then the cloner appears to do absolutely nothing. But the magic is going to happen when we change its mode from iterate to blend. Oh, it's done something, but it's created this weird gravitational pull of a spline, and that is what's happened because of our mismatched spline directions here. If I just turn the cloner off temporarily, so this one, that's the end of the spline, this one's the beginning. So if we make this the beginning, doesn't matter which way around, I can right click in points mode, go to point order, and I can say reverse sequence. Now what you'll find is when I switch my cloner back on, we get this third spline appearing because we set the count to 3, and it's averaged the 2 existing splines to the middle. I mean, I can create more of these. It will just sort of tween between as many as and create as many clones as we want. But in this case, we want that default 3. So now we have this spline running straight the way through the middle of our helix, and that looks suspiciously like the sort of spline we'd want to create a sweep out of. So I don't have access to it yet because it's a sort of parametric version of a spline that's been created inside the cloner. So I can freeze these down now. I'll just go back into point mode, back into object mode. I'm going to right click on my screen, right click on my cloner and say current state to object. Then I can turn all of these off. And now I've got this middle spline here, which is what I want. These are the original splines, which I've got copies of anyway, so I can just delete them. If I come back out here. So now I've got a spline running through the middle of my helix, which is hidden in the middle. So now if I make a sweep object, which I can do by holding the Alt key down, going up to my generators here, selecting sweep, then I'm going to hold my shift key down, come up to the spline menu, and I'm going to make this as an end side because I like end sides. They give me a lot of control over my sides. This goes a bit bonkers because it's clearly too big. Let's make this 12 sides, keep the poly count down, and you can see that I'm holding Alt here so I get increments of my value. This is pretty close to the original spline, helix that we've got. In fact, it's closer than it looks. It looks like it's deviating quite a bit, but that's really just a kind of Phong shading quirk. It's actually very close to the original shape. Good enough for our purposes anyway. So now if I turn off my original spring, and I'll duplicate by holding the control key down my material that I've got for that spring. Here I have a parametrically created spring, which is basically the CAD version, but now because we have our spline, we can animate it exactly as before. So let's very quickly do that. If you'll remember, we used a plane effector as a deformer, just for the sake of showing you a different way of doing things. So I'm just going to select the plane, drop it underneath my spring. I'm not sure what the distances are at this point in time. I'm going to need to switch the plane on as a deformer to a point deformer. And if you remember, I need to set the transform space so that it's not reading the normals on the spline, it's just reading from one reference. That looks like a little bit extreme. So let's say that we want the maximum amount to go down to about there, -4 in this example. And then we need to set some sort of fall off so it doesn't all just move in one go. Now, the complication that we have here, which again is totally normal with things like CAD, the axes that we're moving on are not level. So if we were to make a linear field, by default, if I make it plus Y, and it's probably about, much smaller. If I go to my front view here, see, I can probably eyeball this by pulling it up and down and getting it to work roughly, but you can see that it's pretty far off from the angle that the actual strut is set to. So what we really need is some way of lining up the linear field more accurately, and that's fairly simple to do as long as you've got an object which aligns down the axis that you need, basically up and down this strut column here. Now, quite often when you do get CAD data, there is at least one object, in this case the shock, which has some sort of relevance to the direction of travel. So what we can do to quickly get a linear field in roughly the right area is we can go up to the shock, parent it, and then just hit 0 PSR. Now, although it's turned on its side because it's probably out by 90 degrees, that then becomes much easier to deal with. We're only dealing with increments of 90s. So I can pull that out now and it will stay where it is. It did get smaller, so we'll see why that was in a minute, but I'm just holding the shift key down so I can realign my, I've done it the wrong way. It needs to go 180 degrees now, I think, to be lined up. Now I suspect that my shock was set, you see it was set to a scale of 10, which has meant that my linear field has become 0.1. So it doesn't affect the in these two planes, but it does affect the behavior up and down. Now, it's obviously still rather tricky for me to get this in the right place where I want it to be the right scale and the right scale up and down, and also the right position into the middle here. But I do have handles at least that move it in the right axis. Now, I would say probably the best way for me to be able to deal with the positioning more accurately is to change the work plane. If I select my shock, which we know was roughly in the right angle here, and we say align work plane to selection, now if I go, say, into my front view, it's out by 90 degrees. This looks like the top, but if I go to my top view, now you can see that the strut appears to be perfectly aligned. That's not now relative to the world. We've changed our work plane. So I can select my linear field here and I can pull it up and down and I can actually see what I'm doing. So I want to get it back to how we had before, where it's just lined up in between the cap and that unmoving base. So about there, that'll probably do. And now we have a linear field that we can use for all the other moving elements in our hierarchy. If I want to reset that, I can just say align work plane to Y and we're back to where we started. So now we've got our aligned linear field. And so in order to get this to work properly, I just need to add, I'll just turn off the color affecting there. I need to add a random field, which I'll add over the top. And I'll set it to multiply so that it just attenuates the value of the linear field. It's going all wobbly because the space that it's in is set to field, not none. And now if I set my animation speed to something, I don't know, 350, and we've got a loop of 100, there you can see that we've got an animating spring again. And we can go through the same steps in order to get the sleeve working, animating along with it, and also this cap. That would now be the same as before. So there we go. And you can see that this is a relatively funky shape. If we take off the linear field, you can see it does have a little kink in it. And you have to watch for things like that in real world CAD just to make sure that you haven't messed anything up. This is actually part of the real world structure of this steel spring. It also has this slight drop here. So we've managed to recreate that perfectly using this technique called spline averaging. So there you go, a few interesting tricks from a very old dog. If you like this film and would like to see more from us, do leave your comments and any questions that you have below the video here. And don't forget to follow us on the Twitter thing, because I'll probably be posting more interesting techniques and maybe a few terrible jokes there in the future. And finally, remember, nobody's lucky, so you'd better be good.